I walked into what I thought was my daughter's celebration dinner, expecting hugs and maybe a toast to her promotion. Instead, I found myself staring at a wall covered with family photos, every single memory from her childhood, her graduation, her wedding day. My face was in every picture, but when she introduced me to her colleagues that night, she called me a family friend who helped out when she was younger. 28 years of being her father, and I had become a footnote in my own story. Please like this video and subscribe, because this story gets much deeper. I should have known something was different from the moment I heard her voice on the phone. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I was sitting in my kitchen, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. When my phone rang and I saw Sarah's name on the screen, my heart jumped a little. She hadn't called me in 2 months. "Hi, Dad." Her voice sounded professional, like she was calling a colleague about a work project. Not the warm, slightly rushed tone she used to have when she'd call to tell me about her day or ask for advice about something. This was different, careful. "Sarah, honey, how are you? It's so good to hear from you." There was a pause. A small one, but I noticed it. "I'm doing really well, actually. That's why I'm calling. I got some news at work today." Another pause. "I've been promoted to senior marketing director." I felt genuine pride surge through me. My daughter, the little girl who used to practice her presentations on me using my old briefcase as a podium, was now climbing the corporate ladder at one of the city's most respected marketing firms. "Sarah, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you. Tell me everything." But she didn't tell me everything. She gave me the basics. Bigger salary, corner office, her own team to manage. The facts without. The feelings. When I tried to ask follow-up questions about how she felt, what her new responsibilities would be, whether she was nervous or excited, her answers stayed surface level. Then came the real reason for her call. "I'm having a small celebration dinner next Friday night. Just family and a few work colleagues. Nothing fancy, just dinner at Romano's downtown." She paused again. "I was wondering if you'd like to come." If I'd like to come, as if attending my daughter's promotion celebration was some casual social invitation I might decline if I had better plans. "Of course I'd love to come, sweetheart. What time?" 7 o'clock. It's just going to be maybe 15 people or so, very low key. I wanted to ask who else would be there. Would her mother come? Mike, her husband of 3 years, her college friends? But something in her tone made me hesitate. This felt like a transaction, not a conversation between father and daughter. "That sounds wonderful, Sarah. I'll be there." "Great. I'll text you the details." And that was it. No, "I've missed you, Dad," or "I can't wait to celebrate with you," or even "How have you been?" Just the logistics of showing up to an event where my presence had apparently been considered. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, holding my phone and trying to understand what had just happened. This should have been a moment of joy, of connection. My daughter was succeeding in her career, and she wanted me there to celebrate. But instead of feeling included, I felt like I'd just been granted permission to attend. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own child's life, like you're always on the outside looking in at the family you helped create, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Sometimes sharing these stories helps us all feel a little less alone. I spent the rest of that week thinking about the invitation. Should I have been more excited? Should I have pushed for more details? But mostly I found myself thinking about how we'd gotten to this place where my own daughter called me with the same tone she probably used to invite her accountant to lunch. The distance between us hadn't appeared overnight. It had been building for years, really since her mother and I divorced when Sarah was 12. The divorce itself was messy, not because of money or property, but because of Sarah. Her mother, Linda, had fought for full custody with a determination that caught me completely off guard. During those court hearings, Linda painted a picture of me that I barely recognized. I was absent, she claimed, unreliable, more interested in my work than my family. She had witnesses, neighbors who testified about times I'd worked late, friends who remembered occasions when I'd missed school events because of business trips. All true, technically, but missing the context of a father trying to build a stable life for his family. I tried to defend myself, to explain that every late night and business trip had been about providing for them, about building the kind of security I'd never had growing up. But in family court, good intentions don't carry much weight against documented absences. The judge awarded Linda primary custody, and I got every other weekend plus holidays. Standard divorced father package. Sarah, who was 12 and confused and hurting, went along with it. Maybe she believed what her mother was saying about me. Maybe she was just trying to avoid more conflict. I'll never know. But something changed in her after that. The easy closeness we'd had when she was younger, when she'd beg to help me wash the car or spend hours in the garage while I worked on projects, that disappeared. Our conversations became more formal, our time together more structured. Instead of the natural father-daughter relationship we'd had, everything became scheduled, planned, careful. Still, we maintained a secret. Connection through her teenage years and into college. It wasn't what it had been, but it was something. She'd call when she needed advice about boys or school or her future. I helped her pick her college, co-signed her student loans, walked her down the aisle at her wedding 3 years ago. But after she married Mike, even that careful connection seemed to fade. Our phone calls became less frequent, our visits more awkward. She was building her own life, which was natural and healthy, but I felt myself becoming optional in it. Not absent entirely, but peripheral. The promotion dinner invitation felt like a test I didn't understand. Was this Sarah reaching out, trying to rebuild our relationship? Or was I being invited out of obligation, the way you invite distant relatives to important events because it's the proper thing to do? I decided to treat it as an opportunity. Maybe we could use this celebration to start fresh, to find our way back to each other as adults. I spent hours that week planning what I'd wear, what I'd say, how I could show her that I was proud of the woman she'd become. I went shopping for a gift, something that would acknowledge her professional achievement while also conveying my personal pride in her. I settled on a leather portfolio with her initials engraved on the cover. Professional enough for her new role, personal enough to show I'd put thought into it. The night before the dinner, I practiced conversations in my head. I imagined asking her about her new responsibilities, her goals for the future, her plans with Mike. I imagined her asking about my life, my work, my thoughts on her success. I imagined us talking the way we used to when she was younger, when she still looked at me like I had answers to the important questions. I even imagined her thanking me during whatever speech she might give, acknowledging the role I'd played in hell, ping her become the person she was. Not because I needed the credit, but because it would signal that she still saw me as her father, not just as someone who used to be married to her mother. Looking back, I realized I was setting myself up for disappointment. I was projecting my hopes onto an invitation that had been given in a very different spirit. But at the time, lying in bed the night before the dinner, I felt more optimistic about my relationship with Sarah than I had in years. I remembered teaching her to ride a bike in our old driveway, running alongside her as she wobbled and giggled and finally found her balance. I remembered helping her with math homework at the kitchen table, both of us frustrated but determined to work through the problems together. I remembered the Father's Day cards she'd make me every year until she was 16, elaborate constructions of construction paper and glitter that proclaimed me world's best dad in her careful handwriting. Those memories felt real and solid and permanent. Whatever had gone wrong between us, whatever distance had grown, couldn't erase the foundation we'd built during those early years. The promotion dinner would be our chance to build on that foundation again. I fell asleep that Thursday night planning to arrive a few minutes early, to greet Sarah with genuine enthusiasm, and to spend the evening being the father she deserved, supportive, proud, present in every way that mattered. I had no idea that in less than 24 hours, I would discover that in my daughter's version of her own life story, I had already been written out of the leading role and recast as a minor character. I had no idea that every memory I treasured, every moment of connection I thought we'd shared, had been reframed in a narrative where I was not her father who'd loved her imperfectly, but simply a family friend who'd helped out when times were tough. If I had known what was coming, I might have stayed home that Friday night. But then again, maybe I needed to see it for myself. Maybe I needed to understand exactly where I stood in my daughter's life before I could figure out what to do about it. Romano's restaurant sits on the corner of 5th and Main, the kind of upscale place that Sarah's generation chooses for important occasions. All dark wood and soft lighting, with cloth napkins and wine glasses that catch the light just right. I'd driven past it hundreds of times, but never been inside. As I pulled into the parking lot that Friday evening, I felt nervous in a way I hadn't expected. I'd chosen my navy suit, the one Sarah had complimented 2 Christmases ago, saying it made me look distinguished. I'd gotten my hair cut that afternoon and spent more time than usual making sure I looked presentable. Not because I was trying to impress her colleagues, but because I wanted Sarah to be proud to introduce me as her father. The hostess, a young woman about Sarah's age with a professional smile, checked her list when I gave my name. "You're here for the Williams celebration? Right this way." She led me through the main dining room toward a private area in the back. I could hear conversation and laughter getting louder as we approached, the sound of people already comfortable with each other, already deep into their evening. The private dining room was elegant but intimate, with space for maybe 20 people. About 15 were already there, standing around with drinks, talking in the animated way people do at professional gatherings. I recognized a few faces. Mike, Sarah's husband, was talking to a man I didn't know. A couple of women I thought might be her college friends were laughing by the window. And there was Sarah. She was wearing a black dress I'd never seen before. Sleek, sophisticated, expensive looking. Her hair was styled differently than I remembered, shorter and more angular. She looked successful, confident, like someone who belonged in this room full of accomplished people. For a moment, I felt a surge of pure parental pride. This was my daughter, the little girl who used to insist on wearing her soccer cleats to the grocery store, now commanding a room full of professionals celebrating her promotion. She saw me and smiled, raising her hand in a wave, but she didn't immediately come over, and something about that felt significant. Instead, she finished her conversation with the group she was standing with and then made her way across the room. "Dad, you made it. You look great." She gave me a brief hug, the kind you give relatives at family reunions. Polite, appropriate, but not exactly warm. "Congratulations, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." I handed her the gift bag with the leather portfolio. "Just a little something for your new office." "That's so thoughtful, thank you." She set it aside without opening it. "Let me get you a drink. What would you like?" As she led me toward the bar area, I took in the room more carefully. That's when I saw it. The display that would haunt me for weeks afterward. Someone had set up a professional-looking presentation board near the entrance, titled Sarah's Journey in elegant lettering. It was covered with photographs chronicling Sarah's life from childhood through her recent promotion. The pictures were arranged chronologically, telling the story of a girl growing into a successful woman. I stopped walking and stared. There I was in almost every photo, teaching her to swing a baseball bat in our backyard when she was 7, both of us grinning at the camera. Standing behind her at her high school graduation, my hands on her shoulders, both of us beaming with pride. Walking her down the aisle at her wedding, her arm linked through mine, her dress trailing behind us like something from a fairy tale. The photos told the story of a father who had been present for every major milestone in his daughter's life. Soccer games and school plays, birthday party, ice and family vacations, quiet moments and celebration moments. In picture after picture I was there, not in the background, but as a central figure in the narrative of her growing up. For a few seconds my heart swelled with nostalgia and pride. Here was proof of the relationship I remembered, evidence of the bond we'd shared, documentation of 2 decades of fatherhood that felt real and meaningful and permanent. But then Sarah approached with a colleague, and everything changed. "David, I'd like you to meet Tom, a family friend who was very supportive during my growing up years." The words hit me like cold water in the face. Family friend. I extended my hand automatically, managing to smile and make small talk with David about Sarah's promotion and her bright future, but inside, I was reeling. I glanced back at the photo display. There I was, clear as day, in every significant moment of her life, teaching her to ride a bike, helping her with a science fair project, cheering from the bleachers at her soccer games, dancing with her at her wedding reception. That wasn't a family friend's life documented on that board. That was a father's life. Those were a father's memories, a father's moments, a father's love captured in dozens of photographs spanning more than 2 decades. Yet to this room full of her professional colleagues, I was just Tom, someone who had helped out when she was younger, a peripheral character in a story where I had actually been the co-author. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How do you process being introduced as a family friend while standing 3 feet away from photographic evidence of your central role in someone's life? How do you smile and shake hands and make polite conversation when you're experiencing a kind of emotional vertigo that makes you question everything you thought you knew about your own existence? But I did it. For the next hour, I played along with the alternative reality my daughter had created. I was introduced to her colleagues as Tom, or a longtime family friend, or someone who was really supportive when I was growing up. Each introduction felt like a small death, a tiny erasure of 28 years of being her father. I watched people nod politely when she explained how I'd helped out over the years. I saw them process this information and file me away in their minds as a nice man who had been kind to Sarah's family during difficult times. None of them questioned the narrative, because why would they? It was her story to tell, and she was telling it with confidence and apparent sincerity. But I kept glancing back at those photographs. In one, I was teaching her to change a tire in our driveway, both of us covered in grease but laughing at some joke. In another, I was helping her move into her college dorm, carrying boxes while she directed traffic with the authority of someone who knew exactly where everything should go. These weren't the memories of a family friend who had occasionally helped out. These were the intimate, daily, unremarkable moments that make up the texture of a parent-child relationship. The homework sessions and bedtime stories, the driving lessons and college visits, the quiet conversations and shared experiences that had shaped both of our lives. I found myself studying the other people in the room, wondering what they saw when they looked at me. Did I look like someone who had been peripherally involved in Sarah's upbringing? Did I fit their mental image of a family friend who had stepped in occasionally to help a single mother? Because that, I realized, was the story Sarah had told them. Not explicitly, but by implication. By introducing me as a family friend rather than her father, she had created a narrative where her her had raised her largely alone, with occasional assistance from kind neighbors and family friends. It was a cleaner story, simpler to explain, easier for colleagues to understand and respond to appropriately. But it wasn't true. I had been there for every major milestone documented on that board. I had paid for many of the experiences captured in those photographs, the soccer leagues and music lessons, the school trips and summer camps, the college tuition and wedding expenses. I hadn't just helped out. I had been her father, with all the daily responsibility and deep emotional investment that role entailed. Mike, Sarah's husband, came over at one point, and we chatted briefly about his work and their recent vacation to Costa Rica. He was polite, friendly even, but he treated me exactly like what Sarah had told everyone I was, a family friend catching up at a celebration. There was no acknowledgement of my role as his father-in-law, no reference to shared family experiences or inside jokes, or the complex dynamics that exist between a man and his daughter's husband. It occurred to me that Mike might genuinely believe that Sarah had been raised primarily by her mother, with minimal involvement from her father. How else would Sarah have explained my presence at their wedding, my role in her life, the obvious familiarity we had with each other? She must have crafted a story that positioned me as a supportive family friend rather than the father who had walked her down the aisle. As the evening progressed, I found myself caught between two realities. There was the reality documented on that photo board, a father who had been present and involved and loving, who had shared countless moments with his daughter and had been central to her development into the successful woman she'd become. And there was the reality of this room, where I was a minor character in Sarah's essay. Tori, someone who had played a supporting role during her childhood but wasn't significant enough to merit introduction as family. The strangest part was how easily I fell into playing the role she had assigned me. When people asked how I knew Sarah, I found myself giving vague answers about having known her for a long time or having been close to the family. I didn't correct the narrative, didn't insist on my actual relationship to her. Part of me was too shocked to know how to respond. Part of me didn't want to create a scene at her celebration, and part of me, I think, was curious to see how far this alternate reality extended, how completely I had been rewritten in the story of my own daughter's life. By the time we were called to dinner, I felt like I was watching the evening from outside my own body. I was physically present, participating in conversations, smiling at appropriate moments. But emotionally, I was somewhere else entirely, trying to process what it meant to be erased from your own story, while the evidence of your central role stared back at you from across the room. The dining room was arranged with a long rectangular table, the kind you see at corporate events or wedding receptions. Sarah took her place at the head, naturally, as the guest of honor. Her husband Mike sat to her right, and her assistant manager, a young woman named Jennifer, sat to her left. I was seated about halfway down the table, not in a position of honor, but not relegated to the far end either. It was the seating arrangement you'd expect for a family friend, important enough to be included, but not significant enough for a prime spot. The conversation flowed easily around me. These were Sarah's people, her colleagues, her professional network, the community she'd built around her career and her adult life. They talked about marketing campaigns and client presentations, office politics and industry trends. They shared stories about Sarah's leadership style, her creativity, her dedication to her team. Listen to them describe a version of my daughter I barely recognized, not because she had changed, but because this was a side of her I'd never really seen. The confident executive, the strategic thinker, the mentor to younger employees. I found myself feeling proud and disconnected at the same time, proud of who she'd become, but disconnected from the person who had become it. Mike talked about their recent vacation to Costa Rica, showing photos on his phone of ziplining and beach sunsets. Sarah laughed as he described her initial terror at the heights, then her determination to conquer every adventure the trip offered. I could see glimpses of the little girl I remembered, the one who was afraid of the high dive at the public pool but made herself climb the ladder every day until she could jump without hesitation. But I was hearing about it secondhand, like someone getting a report about a distant relative's activities. These weren't shared experiences we could reminisce about together. These were stories being told by her husband to a table full of people who knew her current life, while I sat there as someone who had known her past. Dinner was excellent. Some kind of salmon with vegetables I didn't recognize, prepared in a way that probably cost more than I usually spend on groceries in a week. The wine was good too, though I was careful not to drink too much. I had the strange feeling that I was being watched, evaluated, that my behavior might be reported back to Sarah later as evidence of whether I was appropriate for these kinds of gatherings. The conversation continued around me, occasionally including me, but mostly flowing past me. I contributed when asked direct questions, shared a few appropriate anecdotes about Sarah's determination and work ethic, but mostly I observed. I watched my daughter command the room with easy confidence, managing multiple conversations while making sure everyone felt included and valued. She was good at this. Whatever else had happened between us, whatever distance had grown in our relationship, she had become the kind of person who could bring people together and make them feel special. I remembered her practicing this skill as a child, organizing elaborate tea parties for her stuffed animals, or directing neighborhood kids in backyard productions of plays she'd written herself. Then came the moment I'll never forget. Sarah stood up, tapping her wine glass with her fork to get everyone's attention. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she began, and the table fell quiet. "This promotion means a lot to me, but having you all here to celebrate makes it even more special." She was poised, articulate, comfortable speaking in front of the group. I felt a flash of pride remembering how I'd helped her practice presentations for school, how we'd worked together on her confidence and public speaking skills. But then I caught myself. Was I allowed to feel proud of her accomplishments when I'd apparently been demoted to family friend status? "I want to thank my amazing team for their support and dedication," she continued, nodding to several people at the table. "Working with you makes even the hardest days feel manageable." Murmurs of appreciation and a few raised glasses. I found myself smiling along with everyone else, caught up in the warmth of the moment despite my confusion about my place in it. "I want to thank Mike, obviously, for being my partner in everything, and for tolerating my work stress with such good humor." She smiled at her husband, who raised his glass in response. "And for convincing me to try ziplining even when I was sure I was going to die." Laughter around the table. I laughed too, because it was a funny story, and because Sarah's happiness was infectious, even when I felt excluded from it. Then her tone shifted slightly, becoming softer and more personal. "I also want to thank my mom, who couldn't be here tonight, but who sacrificed everything to raise me as a single mother. She worked 3 jobs to keep me in good schools, drove me to every practice and game, and showed me that a woman could be strong and independent." The room murmured appreciation, and I felt my chest tighten. Single mother. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I had been there for every game she mentioned. I had paid for those schools she was talking about. I had been the one who drove her to most of those practices, who spent weekends on soccer sidelines and at swim meets, who helped with homework and school projects and college applications. But in Sarah's version of history, her mother had done it all alone. I had been erased from the narrative so completely that my 2 decades of active, involved daily fatherhood had been reduced to nothing. She continued, her voice carrying across the quiet room. My mom showed me that you don't need perfect circumstances to achieve your goals. She taught me that hard work and determination can overcome almost any obstacle. I wanted to interrupt, to stand up and remind everyone that Linda hadn't been a single mother, that she'd had a co-parent who was equally invested in Sarah's success and well-being. I wanted to point to the photo display in the other room, to the evidence of my involvement in every aspect of Sarah's development. But I sat there, frozen, listening to my own existence being written out of my daughter's story in real time. And to all the mentors and family friends who stepped in along the way, Sarah said, her eyes briefly meeting mine across the table. Thank you for believing in me when things were tough. Family friends, again. She raised her glass, looking directly at me for just a moment, and I saw something in her expression that might have been guilt or defiance or apology. I couldn't tell which. I raised my glass with everyone else, but my hand was shaking. Around the table, people were nodding and smiling, moved by Sarah's tribute to her single mother's determination and grateful for the acknowledgement of the family friends who had helped along the way. But I could barely breathe. In her version of events, I wasn't the father who had fought for joint custody because I couldn't bear the thought of being separated from her. I wasn't the dad who had driven 3 hours to her college just to take her out for pancakes when she was homesick. I wasn't the man who had walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes because he was so proud of the woman she'd become. I was just another family friend who had stepped in occasionally to help a struggling single mother. The applause filled the room, warm and genuine, celebrating Sarah's achievements and honoring her mother's sacrifices. I clapped along with everyone else, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and irregular, as I processed what had just happened. Everyone began talking again, commenting on Sarah's speech, sharing their own stories about single mothers and supportive communities. The conversation flowed around me while I sat there trying to understand how I had become a stranger in my own daughter's life story. Had she always seen it this way? Had she genuinely internalized her mother's narrative so completely that she believed I had been peripheral to her upbringing? Or was this a conscious choice, a deliberate rewriting of history to create a simpler, more inspiring story for her professional colleagues? I thought about the custody battle all those years ago, about Linda's testimony that I was absent and unreliable. At the time, I'd assumed Sarah knew the difference between her mother's legal strategy and the reality of our relationship. I'd assumed she understood that I was fighting so hard for time with her because she was the most important thing in my life. But maybe she hadn't understood that. Maybe she'd absorbed her mother's version of events and carried it with her into adulthood, genuinely believing that Linda had raised her alone while I played a minimal, supportive role from the sidelines. Or maybe she knew the truth, but found it easier to tell a different story. Maybe explaining divorced parents and custody arrangements and complicated family dynamics was too messy for professional settings. Maybe it was simpler to present herself as the daughter of a strong single mother rather than the child of a contentious divorce. Either way, the result was the same. I had been erased. 28 years of fatherhood had been reduced to the occasional assistance of a well-meaning family friend. As Sarah sat back down and the conversation resumed, I caught her looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Was she checking to see how I'd reacted to her speech? Was she feeling guilty about the story she told? Or was she simply making sure I was enjoying the evening, the way a good hostess checks on all her guests? I managed to smile back at her, because what else could I do? This was her celebration, her night, her story to tell. But inside, I felt like I was drowning in plain sight, surrounded by people who were laughing and talking and enjoying themselves while I struggled to understand my place in a narrative that had apparently been rewritten without my knowledge or consent. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. People shared more stories, made more toasts, offered more congratulations. I participated when spoken to, smiled when appropriate. but I felt like I was watching the evening from very far away. As the celebration wound down and people began saying their goodbyes, I realized that nothing would ever be quite the same between Sarah and me, not because of anything dramatic or confrontational, but because I now knew exactly how she saw our relationship. I wasn't her father in any meaningful sense, not in her professional life, not in her personal narrative, maybe not even in her own understanding of who she was and how she'd become that person. I was just Tom, a family friend who had helped out when she was younger. Someone worth inviting to important celebrations, but not someone whose role needed to be accurately represented or honestly acknowledged. And the most heartbreaking part was that she seemed completely comfortable with this arrangement, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to introduce your father as a family friend and thank him for stepping in during difficult times. The evening was winding down, and people were beginning to gather their coats and purses, exchanging business cards and making plans for lunch meetings. The energy in the room had shifted from celebration to the pleasant tiredness that comes after a successful social event. I watched Sarah work the room, thanking people individually, accepting congratulations with grace, playing the perfect hostess. I knew I had to talk to her before I left. I couldn't drive home carrying the weight of what I'd just experienced without at least trying to understand it. But I also knew this wasn't the time or place for a serious conversation. Her colleagues were still around. Mike was coordinating ride shares for some of the younger employees, and Sarah was clearly still in professional mode. I waited, making small talk with a few people, helping to gather forgotten items from the table, trying to appear casual, while internally rehearsing what I might say to her. How do you ask your daughter why she's erased you from her life story? How do you have that conversation without sounding accusatory or hurt or desperate? Finally, as the last of her work friends headed toward the parking lot, I approached her near the coat check. She was putting on a light jacket, checking her phone for messages, still in that efficient, it's post-event mode. Sarah, could we talk for a minute, just for a few minutes before I head home? She looked up from her phone, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not surprise exactly, but maybe resignation, as if she'd been expecting this conversation and had been hoping to avoid it. Of course, Dad. Let me just tell Mike I'll meet him at the car in a few minutes. She walked over to her husband, spoke to him briefly, then returned to where I was standing near the now empty photo display. Being next to those pictures again felt surreal. All that evidence of my involvement in her life, while the echoes of her speech about her single mother still rang in my ears. What did you want to talk about? She asked, but her tone suggested she already knew. I took a breath, trying to keep my voice calm and measured. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Why did you introduce me as a family friend tonight? Her face flushed slightly, and she looked away from me toward the restaurant's main dining room, where servers were clearing tables and resetting for the next day's service. Dad, it's complicated. My work friends, they don't need to know all the family details. Family details. The phrase hit me like a slap, as if being her father was some messy complication that was better left unexplained. But Sarah, the photos... I gestured toward the display board. I'm in almost every picture on that board. That's not a family friend's life. That's a father's life. She followed my gaze to the photos, and for a moment I thought I saw something like guilt in her expression, but when she looked back at me, her face had hardened into a defensive mask. I know, but after the divorce, after everything that happened, it's just easier this way. Easier. The word cut deeper than anything else she could have said, because I knew exactly what she meant. It was easier to tell people her mother had raised her as a single parent than to explain the complexities of a divorce that had played out in family court. It was easier to present a simple narrative of maternal sacrifice than to acknowledge the messier reality of two parents who had loved her but couldn't love each other. Easier for whom, Sarah? She shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the exit where Mike was probably waiting. For everyone. For me. For my colleagues. For... It's just less complicated. Less complicated. I wanted to argue with her, to point out that the truth wasn't complicated at all. I was her father. I had raised her alongside her mother for 12 years and remained involved in her life afterward. I had been present for every major milestone she'd celebrated tonight. Those were simple facts, not complex family dynamics that required explanation or justification. But looking at her face, defensive, almost guilty, but also determined, I realized this wasn't really about facts. This was about the story she had chosen to tell about her life. And in that story, I wasn't the loving but imperfect father who had tried his best through a difficult divorce and its aftermath. I was the convenient peripheral character who could be minimized or erased as the narrative required. Sarah, I was there for every soccer game, every school play, every parent-teacher conference. I helped you with your homework, taught you to drive, walked you down the aisle at your wedding. That's not a family-friend's relationship with a child. I know that, Dad, but what? But it doesn't fit the story you want to tell about yourself? But it's embarrassing to have a father who wasn't perfect? But it's simpler to let people believe your mother did it all alone? I could hear my voice rising slightly, and I forced myself to take a breath. This wasn't the conversation I'd planned to have, but the words were coming out anyway, 18 years of confusion and hurt finally finding a voice. That's not fair, she said quietly. It's not about embarrassment. It's about moving forward, about not having to explain every detail of our family history to people who don't need to know it. But I'm not just family history, Sarah. I'm your father, present tense. She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but somehow more final. After the custody hearing, after Mom got primary custody, things changed, Dad. You know they did. They changed because your mother wanted them to change. That doesn't mean our relationship stopped mattering. But it did change, and maybe it was easier for me to adapt to that than to keep fighting it. There it was. The truth I hadn't wanted to face. Sarah hadn't forgotten our relationship or misunderstood its significance. She had made a conscious choice to minimize it, to adapt to her mother's narrative, rather than maintain her own connection to the complexities of having two parents who had failed at marriage but succeeded at loving her. So tonight, when you thanked the family friends who helped out, you were talking about me? She nodded, not meeting my eyes. And when you talked about your mother raising you as a single parent, Dad, she did raise me. After the divorce, I lived with her. She was the one who was there every day, who handled the day-to-day stuff, who had help from your father every other weekend, every holiday, every summer vacation, who had a co-parent who paid child support and college tuition and wedding expenses. That's not single parenthood, Sarah. That's divorced parenthood. But even as I said it, I could see that the distinction didn't matter to her. In her mind, her mother had carried the primary burden of raising her, and everyone else, including me, had been supporting characters in that effort. The conversation was going aware. We were talking about the same facts, but interpreting them through completely different frameworks. To me, I had been a devoted father working within the constraints of a custody arrangement I hadn't chosen. To her, I had been a part-time parent whose involvement, while appreciated, hadn't been central to her development. I should go, she said finally. Mike's waiting, and it's been a long day. Sarah, wait. I reached out and touched her arm gently. I'm proud of you. I'm proud of your promotion, proud of the woman you've become. I wish I understood where I fit in your life. For the first time that evening, her defensive mask slipped, and I saw something vulnerable in her expression. I don't know, Dad. I honestly don't know. It wasn't the answer I'd hoped for, but it was honest, and maybe honesty was better than the polite fiction we'd been maintaining. She hugged me briefly, the same kind of hug she'd given me when I arrived, appropriate but distant, and then walked toward the exit where Mike was indeed waiting by their car. I stood alone in the restaurant's entryway for several minutes after she left, surrounded by the detritus of her celebration, forgotten napkins, a few glasses that hadn't been cleared, the photo display that told the story of a father's love for his daughter in dozens of images that apparently no longer carried the meaning they once had. When I finally walked to my car, I felt like I was leaving more than just a restaurant. I was leaving behind the last of my illusions about my relationship with my daughter, the comforting belief that our connection was stronger than the circumstances that had complicated it. The drive home would give me 45 minutes to process what had just happened, but I already knew that this conversation would replay in my mind for weeks. Not because it had been dramatic or angry, but because it had been so quietly devastating. Sarah didn't hate me, or resent me, or blame me for the divorce. She simply didn't see me as central to her story anymore. I had been reclassified, demoted from father to family friend, and she seemed perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. The question now was whether I could learn to be comfortable with it too. The parking lot at Romano's was nearly empty when I finally made my way to my car. A few employees were leaving through the back entrance, and a couple was having what looked like an intense conversation near a silver sedan, but mostly it was just me and the sound of my own footsteps on the asphalt. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, trying to process what had just happened. The conversation with Sarah replayed in my mind like a song stuck on repeat. Her defensive tone, her inability to meet my eyes, her casual dismissal of 28 years of fatherhood as family details that were too complicated to explain. The drive home would take 45 minutes on a good night, and traffic was light. I pulled out of the parking lot and onto Main Street, past the coffee shops and boutiques that made up our downtown area, past the park where I'd taught Sarah to ride a bike when she was 6 years old. I tried to focus on the road, on the practical task of getting home safely, but my mind kept drifting back to the restaurant, to the photo display, to the speech that had rewritten my existence in real time. The radio was playing soft jazz, some instrumental piece I didn't recognize, but the music felt too cheerful for my mood. I turned it off and drove in silence, with only the hum of the engine and the occasional sound of other cars passing by. I found myself thinking about the leather portfolio I'd given Sarah, the one she'd set aside without opening. It was still in its gift bag, probably forgotten on a table at the restaurant or maybe in the back seat of Mike's car. I'd spent an hour at the store choosing it, making sure the leather was the right shade of brown, making sure her initials were engraved clearly. I'd imagined her opening it, understanding that it was both practical and personal, a symbol of my pride in her professional achievement. But she'd thanked me the same way she might have thanked any family friend for a thoughtful gift. Polite appreciation without any deeper recognition of what the gesture meant or who it came from. Traffic was light, and I made good time through the suburban stretch of road between downtown and my neighborhood, past the shopping centers and chain restaurants, past the elementary school where Sarah had played on the playground and performed in holiday concerts, past the intersection where I'd pick her up after soccer practice twice a week for 6 years. Every familiar landmark triggered another memory, another moment from the relationship that Sarah had apparently chosen to minimize or forget. The ice cream shop where we'd celebrated her first A in math. The movie theater where we'd seen every Disney release from the time she was 4 until she was 12. The bookstore where we'd spent countless Saturday mornings browsing and reading together. Had those moments meant so little to her, or had they simply been overwhelmed by the larger narrative her mother had constructed, the story of a single parent struggling to raise her daughter with minimal help from an absent father? I started questioning everything. Had I really been the father I thought I was? During the divorce proceedings, Linda had painted a picture of me as unreliable, absent, more focused on my career than my family. She'd had witnesses, neighbors who testified about the times I'd worked late, colleagues who remembered business trips that had conflicted with school events. All of it was technically true. I had worked long hours, especially when Sarah was younger and I was trying to establish my career. I had traveled for work, missing some school plays and parent-teacher conferences. I had sometimes been tired or distracted. I came home from difficult days at the office, but Linda's testimony had stripped away all the context, all the reasons behind those choices. Every late night at the office had been about building financial security for our family. Every business trip had been about advancing in a career that would allow us to live in a good neighborhood with good schools. Every moment I'd spent focused on work had been motivated by love for Sarah and Linda, by the desire to give them the kind of stable, comfortable life I'd never had growing up. I'd tried to explain this during the custody hearing, but the family court judge wasn't interested in my motivations. He was interested in facts. How many school events had I missed? How many nights had I come home after Sarah's bedtime? How many weekends had I spent in the office instead of with my family? The facts, without context, painted a picture of a father who was peripherally involved in his daughter's life. And maybe that's how Sarah had learned to see me, not as a man who was working to provide for her, but as someone who was often absent when she needed him. The memories came flooding back as I drove through the darkness, teaching her to drive in an empty parking lot behind the community center, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, both of us laughing when she accidentally hit the windshield wipers instead of the turn signal. The night she'd called me from college crying because she'd failed her first chemistry exam, I'd driven 3 hours to her campus just to take her out for pancakes at an all-night diner, listening to her fears about not being smart enough for pre-med, reminding her that one test didn't define her capabilities or her future. Her wedding day, when she'd squeezed my arm as we walked down the aisle and whispered, "Thank you for always believing in me, Dad." The pride I'd felt in that moment, the sense of completion, the joy of watching her begin her own adult life with someone who clearly adored her. But I also remembered the harder moments, the custody hearing when she was 12, sitting in that sterile courtroom while lawyers dissected our family and turned our private struggles into legal arguments. Watching Sarah testify that she wanted to live with her mother full-time, understanding that she was probably just trying to avoid further conflict, but feeling like my heart was being torn out of my chest. The gradual shift in our relationship after the divorce, the way she stopped calling me daddy and started using the more formal dad, the way our conversations became more scheduled and less spontaneous, the way she began to seem slightly uncomfortable during our weekends together, as if she was visiting a relative rather than spending time with her father. Maybe tonight's revelation hadn't come out of nowhere. Maybe Sarah's casual erasure of my role in her life had been building for years, and I'd been too hopeful or too proud to see it clearly. I thought about my brother Mark's similar experience with his son Jake, the wedding where Mark had stood in the back like an uninvited stranger, watching his own child get married without acknowledgement or recognition. Two brothers, both written out of their children's stories in favor of simpler narratives that didn't require explanation or justification. Was this becoming common? Were divorced fathers routinely erased from their children's life stories, reduced to supporting characters in narratives that centered on single mothers' heroic struggles? Or was this something specific to our family, some failure on my part that had made it easy for Sarah to minimize my significance? I pulled into my driveway as these questions swirled through my mind without resolution. The house was dark and quiet. It had been just me since my divorce 2 years ago, when I'd finally admitted that my second marriage wasn't working either. Another failure. Another relationship that I'd apparently been unable to maintain despite my best intentions. I sat in the car for a few more minutes, looking at my house and thinking about the evening I'd just experienced. In a few hours, Sarah would probably tell Mike about our conversation, maybe explaining that her father had been a little emotional about being introduced as a family friend. Mike would nod sympathetically, understanding that family dynamics can be complicated, especially after divorce. Neither of them would see anything wrong with the arrangement. Sarah had found a way to acknowledge my existence without having to explain the messy details of our relationship. I was included but not central, present but not significant. It was a practical solution to the problem of having a father who didn't fit neatly into her preferred narrative. But as I finally got out of the car and walked toward my front door, I realized that practical solutions don't always account for the emotional cost to the people being managed. Sarah might have found a comfortable way to categorize our relationship, but I was left to figure out how to live with being demoted from father to family friend without my knowledge or consent. The house felt especially quiet that night, filled with the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing and heartbeat. I poured myself a drink and sat in my living room, surrounded by framed photos that told the story of Sarah's childhood from my perspective. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings, vacation trips and ordinary afternoons that had felt significant because we were spending them together. Those photos told a different story than the one Sarah had shared at her celebration dinner. They showed a father who had been present, involved, emotionally invested in his daughter's development and happiness. They documented a relation, kinship that had been central to both of our lives, regardless of how it was currently being characterized. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I was holding on to a version of our relationship that no longer existed, if it ever had. Maybe Sarah's view of our history was just as valid as mine, and I needed to accept that being her father didn't automatically entitle me to a central role in her adult life or her personal narrative. The question was whether I could learn to be content with being Tom, the family friend who had helped out when she was younger, or whether I needed to find a way to reclaim my identity as her father, regardless of how she chose to frame our relationship. That night, sitting alone in my quiet house, I honestly didn't know which path would lead to less pain. 3 days passed after the dinner, and I found myself moving through my regular routine like someone recovering from a minor illness. I went to work, handled my responsibilities, made appropriate conversation with colleagues and clients, but everything felt slightly off-center, as if I was performing the motions of my life without fully inhabiting them. I kept replaying the evening, not just the conversation with Sarah, but the entire experience of being introduced as a family friend while photographic evidence of my fatherhood stared back at me from across the room. I found myself questioning memories I'd always trusted, wondering if my recollection of our relationship was somehow distorted or self-serving. Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, trying to focus on an article about local budget concerns, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my brother Mark's name, and I felt a small lift of spirits. Mark and I didn't talk frequently, maybe once every month or two, but our conversations were always easy and comfortable, the kind of relationship that picks up wherever it left off without awkwardness or effort. "Hey Mark, how's Arizona? Treating you?" "Can't complain about the weather," he said, but something in his voice sounded different. Tired, maybe, or strained. "Listen, Tom, I need to tell you something, and it's going to sound crazy." I set down the newspaper and gave him my full attention. Mark wasn't given to drama or exaggeration, so if he was calling something crazy, it was worth hearing. "I'm listening." "I went to Jake's wedding last month." Jake was Mark's oldest son, my nephew, a kid I hadn't seen in probably 5 years despite our good intentions to stay in better touch. I knew he'd gotten engaged sometime last year, but I hadn't heard about wedding plans or received an invitation. "That's great, Mark. How was it? I didn't realize it was happening so soon." There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. "I wasn't invited, Tom." The words hit me like cold water. "What do you mean you weren't invited?" "I mean I wasn't invited to my own son's wedding. I heard about it from a mutual friend, someone who mentioned seeing Jake in a tux at the country club. That's how I found out my oldest boy was getting married." I felt my stomach tighten. The parallels to my own situation were uncomfortably obvious, but I tried to focus on Mark's immediate pain rather than my own recent revelation. "Jesus, Mark, I'm so sorry. What did you do?" "I drove by the reception, just to maybe catch a glimpse of him, you know? See him in his tux, see if he looked happy." His voice cracked slightly. "I ended up staying for the whole thing, Tom. I stood in the back like some kind of stalker, watching my own son get married. The image was heartbreaking. My brother, a good man who'd worked hard his entire life to provide for his kids, reduced to spying on his son's wedding from the back of the room like an uninvited stranger." "Did Jake see you?" "I don't think so. There were probably 200 people there, and I stayed way in the back near the exit, but I could see everything. The ceremony, the reception, the speeches." He paused again. "That's the part I need to tell you about, Tom. The speeches." I waited, already dreading what was coming. His mother got up to make a toast. Beautiful speech about Jake and his new wife, about love and commitment and building a life together. Then she started talking about how proud she was of the man Jake had become, about all the people who had helped raise her boys, Jake and his younger brother, after she became a single mother. The phrase hit me like an echo of Sarah's dinner speech. Single mother. The same narrative, the same erasure. She thanked the neighbors who'd helped with carpools. She thanked the teachers who'd gone above and beyond. She thanked the coaches who'd been father figures to her sons. She went through this whole list of people who had stepped in to help her raise the boys alone. Mark's voice was getting quieter, and I could hear the pain he was trying to control. 25 years of being his father, Tom. 25 years of little league games and homework help and driving lessons and college visits. 25 years of child support payments and birthday presents and trying to maintain a relationship despite a custody arrangement that made me a weekend visitor in my own kids' lives. I knew the story. Mark's divorce had been even messier than mine, with accusations and counter-accusations that had poisoned the well for years. His ex-wife had moved the kids 3 states away, making regular contact difficult and expensive. But he'd tried, driving 8 hours each way for weekend visits, flying out for school events when he could afford it, sending cards and letters and care packages even when the responses were minimal or non-existent. She never mentioned me once, Tom, not once. In her version of events, she'd raised those boys as a single mother with help from the community, from teachers and coaches and neighbors. I didn't even exist in the story of my own son's childhood. The parallel to my own experience was so exact it made my chest hurt. 2 brothers, both written out of their children's narratives, both reduced to non-entities in stories that should have featured them as central characters. Mark, I'm so sorry. That must have been devastating. The thing is, I keep thinking about what I did wrong. Was I really that absent? Was I really that unimportant in their lives? But then I remember teaching Jake to throw a curveball in the backyard. I remember helping him with his college applications, driving him to campus for his freshman orientation. I remember the weekend trips and the phone calls and all the ways I tried to stay connected despite the distance and the complications. I found myself nodding, even though he couldn't see me, the same questions I'd been asking myself since Sarah's dinner. But maybe, Mark continued, maybe it's easier for them to write us out than to deal with the complexity of having fathers who tried but weren't perfect. Maybe it's simpler to create a narrative where their mothers were heroes who did it all alone, rather than acknowledge that they had 2 parents who loved them but couldn't love each other. We talked for over an hour, sharing experiences we'd both been too proud or too hurt to discuss before. Mark told me about graduations he hadn't been invited to, about a grandson he'd never met because Jake's wife didn't know he existed, about Christmas cards that arrived with no return address and were signed simply Jake, with no personal message. I told him about Sarah's dinner, about being introduced as a family friend, while surrounded by photos that documented my central role in her childhood, about the speech that had recast me as someone who had helped out, rather than someone who had been her father for 8 years. The crazy thing, Mark said near the end of our conversation, is that I understand why they do it. It's cleaner, simpler, easier to explain to new people in their lives. Instead of having to get into the complicated history of divorce and custody battles and imperfect relationships, they can just say their mothers raised them alone with occasional help from family friends. But it's not true, I said. No, it's not true. But maybe truth isn't the point. Maybe they need a version of their history that makes them feel strong and independent, that honors their mother's sacrifices without having to acknowledge their father's failures. Or their father's love, I added quietly. Yeah, that too. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing the conversation. The relief of knowing I wasn't alone in this experience was enormous, but it was coupled with a deeper sadness about what this pattern might mean for fathers and their adult children more broadly. Were we part of a larger phenomenon? Were divorced fathers routinely being erased from their children's life stories in favor of narratives that were simpler to explain and more inspiring to hear? Was this the unintended consequence of well-meaning efforts to honor single mothers' struggles? Or was this something more specific, the result of custody battles that had positioned mothers as primary parents and fathers as visiting outsiders, creating a dynamic that persisted into adulthood even when the legal arrangements no longer applied? I thought about the other divorced fathers I knew, wondering if they'd had similar experiences but were too proud or too hurt to talk about them. How many of us were sitting alone in quiet houses, wondering how we'd been transformed from fathers into family friends without our knowledge or consent? That evening, I pulled out photo albums I hadn't looked at in years. Pictures of Sarah as a baby, as a toddler, as a school-age child. Evidence of a relationship that had been central to both of our lives, regardless of how it was currently being characterized or remembered. But for the first time since her dinner, I didn't feel completely alone with this pain. Mark was dealing with the same erasure, the same questions, the same grief over a relationship that had been redefined without his input or agreement. It didn't make the situation less painful, but it made it feel less personal. This wasn't necessarily about my failures as a father or Sarah's deficiencies as a daughter. This might be about larger cultural patterns, about the stories we tell ourselves about family and divorce and resilience. Understanding that didn't solve anything, but it gave me a different framework for thinking about what had happened and what I might do about it. A week passed after my conversation with Mark, then two. The house settled into a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. Quiet but not lonely, orderly but not empty. For the first time since Sarah's promotion dinner, I wasn't spending my evenings composing text messages I wouldn't send or rehearsing phone conversations I was afraid to have. Sarah didn't call, and I didn't reach out to her. This wasn't a conscious decision at first, more like an absence of the usual impulse to maintain contact. But as the days went by, I realized I was experiencing something I hadn't felt in years, relief from the constant low-level anxiety of trying to manage our relationship. For as long as I could remember, I'd been the one initiating contact. I'd send thinking of you texts about articles I'd seen that might interest her, or photos from our shared past that I'd come across while organizing old files. I'd leave voicemails about family news or local events, always trying to strike the right tone. Interested, but not intrusive. Affectionate, but not needy. Now, for the first time, I wasn't doing any of that. I wasn't checking my phone, hoping for messages that rarely came. I wasn't crafting careful communications designed to bridge a gap that seemed to widen despite my efforts. I wasn't performing the full emotional labor of maintaining a relationship with someone who had apparently categorized me as a family friend. The silence felt strange at first, like breaking a habit I'd maintained for so long I'd forgotten it was a choice, but it also felt liberating in a way that surprised me. I started paying attention to other aspects of my life that I'd been neglecting, while so much of my emotional energy was focused on trying to reconnect with Sarah. My house, for instance, had been functioning but not thriving. I'd been maintaining it but not improving it, living in it but not really inhabiting it. I spent a Saturday morning cleaning out the garage, something I'd been meaning to do for months. In the back corner, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old tax returns, I rediscovered my collection of model airplanes, a hobby I'd abandoned years ago when life got too busy and complicated. There were probably 15 planes in various stages of completion, from simple gliders to complex radio-controlled models with intricate details. I'd forgotten how much I used to enjoy the precise meditative work of assembly, the satisfaction of seeing something take shape under careful attention. As I was examining one of the more complex models, trying to remember where I'd left off in its construction, my neighbor Mrs. Chen appeared at the garage door. "Tom, I hope you don't mind me bothering you," she said in her formal but friendly way. "My grandson David has been asking about those airplanes he can see through your garage window. He's very interested in how they work." Mrs. Chen was probably 70, a widow who'd moved in next door about 3 years ago to be closer to her daughter's family. I'd helped her with a few household repairs over the years, and we'd developed the kind of neighborly relationship that was pleasant but not intrusive. "He's welcome to come look at them," I said. "Is he here now?" "He's staying with me this weekend. Would Saturday afternoon be convenient?" David turned out to be 8 years old, with the kind of intense curiosity that reminded me of Sarah at that age. He examined each plane with careful attention, asking detailed questions about how they flew, what made them stay in the air, whether they could really carry people. I found myself explaining basic principles of aerodynamics in terms an 8-year-old could understand, demonstrating how wing shapes created lift, showing him the difference between gliders that rode air currents and powered planes that generated their own thrust. His enthusiasm was infectious and completely genuine. He didn't know about my failures as a husband, or the custody battles, or any of the complicated history that Sarah carried around like emotional baggage. To him, I was just Tom, the neighbor who knew fascinating things about airplanes and had infinite patience for questions. "Could we build one together?" he asked as the afternoon wore on. "A simple one, just to see how it works?" I looked at Mrs. Chen, who nodded approvingly. "If you have time and don't mind, David would love that. He's been talking about airplanes all week." We spent 3 hours that Saturday building a basic balsa wood glider. David's concentration was absolute, his questions thoughtful, his excitement genuine when we took the finished plane outside for its first flight. When it soared across the backyard in a graceful arc before landing softly in Mrs. Chen's flower bed, he literally jumped up and down with joy. Tom, you're the best teacher ever, he said, running to retrieve the plane. Can we build another one next weekend? It was such a simple moment, but it carried weight I hadn't expected. Here was someone who appreciated me for exactly who I was, without qualification or reservation or complicated history. Someone who saw value in what I had to offer without needing to categorize or minimize or explain it to anyone else. I also reconnected with old friends I'd been neglecting while so focused on my relationship with Sarah. My college roommate Jim called on a Wednesday evening, inviting me to join his weekly golf group. "We need a fourth, and you used to be decent at this game," he said with the casual insult that marks true friendship. "Plus, you've been too hermit-like lately. Time to get back among the living." I'd played golf regularly in my 30s and 40s, but had let it slide in recent years, always finding reasons to decline invitations or postpone games. Too much work, too many family obligations, too much energy spent on maintaining relationships that required constant attention. But that Thursday morning, I found myself at the country club with Jim and two other men I'd known for decades, people who remembered who I'd been before divorce and custody battles and family complications made everything more difficult. Being around people who'd known me that long felt like coming home to a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. They remembered my sense of humor, my competitiveness on the golf course, my ability to tell stories that made people laugh. They knew me as Tom the friend, Tom the colleague, Tom the guy who could fix almost anything, and who remembered everyone's birthday. It wasn't that they didn't know about my family situation. These were old friends who'd been present for both my marriages, both my divorces, who'd offered support during the difficult periods and celebrated during the good times, but they didn't relate to me primarily through the lens of my parental relationships or my romantic failures. To them, I was a complete person with multiple facets and capabilities, not just a father struggling to maintain relevance in his daughter's life. The revelation was gradual but profound. I had been so focused on earning my way back into Sarah's good graces that I'd forgotten I had value beyond my role as her father. I was a good neighbor, someone who could teach an 8-year-old about flight and patience. I was a loyal friend, someone worth including in weekly golf games and informal social gatherings. I was a man with skills and stories and experiences worth sharing. For years, I'd let my sense of worth depend entirely on whether Sarah acknowledged my significance in her life. I'd measured my success as a human being by whether my daughter returned my calls promptly or included me meaningfully in her major life events. But sitting on the clubhouse patio after golf, listening to Jim tell stories about his grandchildren and his recent retirement, I realized how limiting that perspective had become. I had allowed one relationship, admittedly the most important one in my life, to define my entire sense of identity and purpose. That didn't mean I stopped caring about Sarah or stopped wanting a better relationship with her, but I began to understand that my happiness and self-worth couldn't depend entirely on her recognition of our shared history or her willingness to include me in her ongoing narrative. I started thinking about what it would mean to build a life that was fulfilling and meaningful, regardless of how Sarah chose to characterize our relationship. What would it look like to be content being Tom, the family friend, if that's all she was comfortable with? Could I find peace in knowing the truth about our history, even if she chose to tell a different story? The questions didn't have easy answers, but for the first time in months, I felt like I had the emotional space to explore them, without the constant urgency of trying to repair something that might not want to be repaired. 2 weeks after that first afternoon with David, we'd built 3 more planes together, each one slightly more complex than the last. His progress was remarkable, his enthusiasm unwavering. Mrs. Chen mentioned that he'd been drawing pictures of airplanes at school and checking out library books about aviation pioneers. "You've given him a new passion," she told me one evening as we watched David test fly his latest creation in the fading light. "His parents are amazed at how focused he's become on this hobby." Watching David's concentration and joy, I remembered something I'd forgotten about the pleasure of being valued for what you could offer, rather than tolerated, despite what you couldn't provide. The boy's appreciation wasn't complicated by history or expectations or disappointment. It was pure and immediate and honest. That night, I realized I had stopped checking my phone obsessively for messages from Sarah. I had stopped composing mental letters explaining my side of our relationship. I had stopped trying to solve the puzzle of how to become central to her life again. Instead, I was building model airplanes and playing golf, and having conversations with people who knew me as someone other than a father struggling to maintain relevance. It felt like the beginning of something I hadn't experienced in years. Contentment with my own company and my own contributions to the world, independent of anyone else's recognition or approval. 3 months after Sarah's promotion dinner, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening while I was in the garage with David, working on our most ambitious project yet. A radio-controlled plane with a 2-foot wingspan and enough complexity to keep us busy for weeks. When I saw Sarah's name on the screen, my first reaction wasn't the usual mixture of hope and anxiety. Instead, I felt a calm curiosity about what she might need. "Hello, Sarah." "Hi, Dad. How are you doing?" Her voice sounded different than it had at the restaurant, softer, less formal, with something that might have been uncertainty threading through it. "I'm doing well, actually, just working on a project in the garage. What's going on? I was wondering if you'd like to meet for lunch sometime." "Me soon. There are some things I'd like to talk about." 3 months ago, this call would have sent my heart racing with hope and questions and the desperate desire to repair whatever had gone wrong between us. But sitting in my garage, surrounded by the peaceful concentration of our airplane construction, I felt something different, genuine interest, but without the urgent need for reconciliation that had driven so many of our previous interactions. "Sure, that sounds fine. When were you thinking?" We arranged to meet the following Saturday at a quiet cafe downtown, the kind of neutral territory that suggested this conversation might be significant. After we hung up, David looked up from the wing section he was carefully sanding. "Was that Sarah?" he asked. In the months we'd been working together, I'd mentioned my daughter occasionally, usually in the context of memories triggered by our projects. "Yes, it was. We're going to have lunch next weekend." "That's good," he said with the simple wisdom of an 8-year-old. "Families should talk to each other." He went back to his sanding, completely absorbed in getting the surface perfectly smooth. I watched him work, marveling at his patience and precision, and realized that whatever conversation Sarah and I were going to have, it would be happening from a different emotional place than our previous interactions. The week passed normally. Work, golf with Jim's group, an evening helping Mrs. Chen assemble a bookshelf she'd ordered online, more time with David on our plane. I found myself thinking about the upcoming lunch without the obsessive preparation I'd once brought to conversations with Sarah. I wasn't rehearsing arguments or planning strategies for reconnection. I was simply curious about what she wanted to discuss. Saturday afternoon arrived clear and warm, perfect weather for flying model planes, but instead reserved for whatever Sarah needed to say. The cafe she'd chosen was small and comfortable, the kind of place where conversations could happen without interruption or performance. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee and what looked like nervous energy. She stood to hug me when I approached, a gesture that felt more genuine than the polite embraces we'd exchanged at the restaurant. "Thanks for meeting me," she said as we settled into our seats. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to, after everything." "Of course I wanted to meet with you, Sarah. You're my daughter." She looked down at her coffee cup, and when she looked back up, I saw something vulnerable in her expression that I hadn't seen in years. "I'm pregnant, Dad." The announcement hit me with a complex mixture of emotions. Joy at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, concern for Sarah and Mike as they prepared for parenthood, and an immediate question about what role, if any, I might play in my grandchild's life. "Sarah, that's wonderful news. Congratulations. How are you feeling? When is the baby due?" "Thank you. I'm feeling good, mostly. A little nervous, obviously. The baby's due in early spring." She paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever she wanted to say next. "The thing is, becoming a parent has made me think a lot about my own childhood, about family, about the kind of mother I want to be." I waited, sensing that she was working her way towards something important. "I've been thinking about the dinner, about our conversation afterward, about some things I said that weren't completely fair." This was the moment I might once have jumped on, eager to relitigate old grievances or press for acknowledgments I'd felt I deserved. But sitting across from my pregnant daughter, I found I didn't need those acknowledgments as desperately as I'd once thought. "Sarah, you don't need to—" "No, I do need to say this," she interrupted gently but firmly. "I think I've been carrying around Mom's version of the divorce fall, or so long that I started believing it was the only version, and that wasn't fair to you or to me or to the truth about what actually happened." I felt something shift in my chest, not the desperate relief I'd once imagined, but something quieter and more sustainable. The truth is complicated, I said. Your mother wasn't wrong about everything. I did work too much when you were younger. I did miss things I should have been present for. I made mistakes. But you were still my father. You were still there for the important things, and for a lot of the unimportant things too. And I think I've been minimizing that because it was easier than dealing with the complexity of having two parents who loved me but couldn't love each other. We talked for 2 hours, covering ground we'd never explored before. Her memories of the custody hearing, the ways she'd learned to navigate between two households with different rules and expectations, the gradual process by which she'd internalized her mother's narrative about our family. She didn't apologize for the promotion dinner, exactly, but she acknowledged that introducing me as a family friend had been a way of avoiding conversations she didn't want to have with her colleagues. It was, she admitted, easier to let people believe her mother had raised her alone than to explain the realities of joint custody and weekend visits, and the complicated dance of divorced parents trying to co-parent successfully. But that doesn't make it right, she said, and it doesn't make it true. More importantly, we talked about the future, about what kind of grandfather I might want to be, about how we might rebuild a relationship that acknowledged both our shared history and our current realities. I don't want my child to grow up thinking you're just a family friend, she said near the end of our conversation. I want them to know our grandfather, to know the person who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra and walked me down the aisle at my wedding. Part of me wanted to rush toward this olive branch, to hope that impending parenthood had fundamentally changed Sarah's perspective on our relationship. But I'd learned something important in the months of silence between us, something about the difference between desperate reconciliation and sustainable connection. I'd like that too, Sarah, but I think we need to build something new rather than trying to recreate what we used to have. We're both different people now than we were when you were 12 or 18 or even 28. She nodded, seeming to understand what I meant. I'd like that, building something new, I mean. When we parted ways that afternoon, we hugged with genuine warmth, but without the desperate clinging I might once have brought to such a moment. This felt like the beginning of something, rather than the restoration of something that had been lost. That evening, I met David in the garage for our regular weekend session. We were putting the finishing touches on our radio-controlled plane, adding the final details that would make it ready for its maiden flight. "How was lunch with Sarah?" he asked, as he carefully applied decals to the wing surfaces. "It was good, really good actually. She's going to have a baby in the spring." "That's exciting. You'll be a grandfather." He paused in his work, looking up at me with his serious 8-year-old expression. "Are you happy about that?" "Yes, I am. Very happy." "Good. Grandfathers are important. Mine taught me how to whistle, and how to skip stones, and how to make paper airplanes that actually fly." As we worked together in the peaceful concentration of our shared project, I realized that David had taught me something crucial about relationships and identity. He had never known me as anything other than Tom, the neighbor who knew about airplanes and had infinite patience for questions. He had no investment in my history as a father or my struggles as a divorced parent. To him, I was simply a complete person, worthy of respect and friendship. That relationship had reminded me that being a good father wasn't the only way to be a good person, and that my worth didn't depend entirely on any one person's recognition of my contributions to their life. When I called Sarah back the following week to accept her lunch invitation, my voice was calm and genuinely curious about what our relationship could become. I wasn't desperate for acknowledgement anymore, wasn't frantic to reclaim a central role in her narrative. I was simply open to whatever authentic connection we might be able to build, based on who we were now rather than who we had been to each other in the past. Sarah might always choose to tell simplified versions of her story in professional settings or casual conversations with new people. That was her right, and I was learning to understand that such choices weren't necessarily about me or my worth as her father. But I also knew the truth about our relationship. The daily moments and quiet sacrifices, the homework help and driving lessons, the bedtime stories and college visits that had shaped both of our lives. That truth didn't depend on her public acknowledgement to remain real and meaningful. I was a father who had loved his daughter imperfectly but genuinely. I was also a neighbor who could teach children about aviation, a friend worth including in weekly golf games, a man with stories and skills and years of experience worth sharing. The photographs from her celebration dinner didn't lie, regardless of the narrative that had been constructed around them. They documented a relationship that had been central to both of our lives, and that documentation would always exist, whether or not it was ever publicly acknowledged. As David and I prepared our plane for its first flight test, watching him concentrate with the same intensity Sarah had once brought to her childhood projects, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, contentment with my own identity, independent of anyone else's recognition or approval. Being erased from one story, I had learned, doesn't mean you cease to exist. It just means you have to find other stories worth being part of, other relationships worth nurturing, other ways of contributing to the world that don't depend on any single person's validation. The plane flew beautifully that afternoon, soaring across the park in smooth, controlled circles while David worked the controls with increasing confidence. As we watched it climb and dive and turn in response to his commands, I realized that some of the most meaningful relationships in life begin without history or expectations or complicated narratives. Sometimes the best connections are the ones where you simply show up as yourself, offering what you have to give, and trust that it will be enough.